Hello, MrShine here from HearthstonePlayers.com. Today I'm bringing you another episode of my Arena Quiz series. For the uninitiated, I'm on a mission to complete an arena run for every hero in Hearthstone, typically starting with some of the least played. Each hero gets two videos. One is a drafting quiz, and the other is the run wrap-up and play analysis. We've already done Priest, Warrior, and Shaman, and now we dissect a draft from arguably the worst hero for the arena, Warlock. But MrShine, I hear you say, Warlock is one of the strongest classes in the game, especially in Constructed. Everyone and their mother has played a Zoo deck, and Handlock is still one of the top decks around in tournament play. And you'd be right, Warlock is indeed a fearsome Constructed class. Why is this? Life Tap. The ability to draw a card for 2 life is very strong when you have a cohesive deck and can fish for answers. But Arena doesn't have the luxury of a tightly cohesive deck list, and therefore it's not as useful as a hero power that does damage like Mage. Constructed also lets you ignore the low-value Warlock cards like Sense Demons or Corruption, but in Arena they get their chance like any other card, and every Sacrificial Pact that shows up in the draft is one less Yeti or Ogre getting a chance to shine. So we're at a bit of a natural disadvantage picking Warlock, but there are ways to salvage a deck. The first is to build a more aggressive curve with your Warlock deck, focusing on more 1 and 2 drops than you might otherwise. This strategy makes use of Life Tap to continue supplying threats with the hope of overwhelming the board, and then being able to make good trades, similar to how Zoo decks function. The second route is more of a control route, with Warlock's strong removal cards, Soulfire and Shadowbolt, and then rely on some big bruisers in the late game. Warlock can actually be surprisingly effective with a more late game controlling focus. Of course, in both of the previous situations, you'll need to let the cards dictate the path you go. And even if you go the Zoo route, I strongly advise avoiding 1 HP minions in most cases, since Arena is filled with heroes that can ping, and spending 3 mana and 2 HP to tap and play a 1 mana minion is a losing proposition if the enemy mage can simply spend 2 mana to clear it with Fire Blast. So now that you have some background, let's move to the Arena Quiz. Give yourself 100 points, and then pause between my picks. I'll assign a point value to every card we have the option of picking, and hopefully by the time the draft is done you'll have dodged enough of the negative value picks flying all over that you'll post a respectable score that you can use to pick up chicks at parties. Here we go, Warlock deck activate. Form of something that doesn't suck. Terrible first set of picks. All are bad, but I went with Master Swordsmith because he's the cheapest of the bad cards, so he won't always clog up a turn to play. And with a few 1-drop minions Warlock has available, it might be able to buff something before it dies. Cold Light Oracle has similarly bad stats at 3 mana, and his Battlecry is probably the worst in a Warlock deck, since you have access to a new card anytime you feel like spending some mana and HP. Ancient Mage has awful stat allocation, and its Battlecry is very situational. Bad stats, situational, and clogging up the valuable 4 slot is the trinity of bad in the arena. Can't get much worse from here. Frost Elemental is the only decent card here. Its stats are poor for 6 mana, but the Battlecry can be a strong tempo play, as it can freeze an important target and give you a chance to make a good trade the following turn. Reckless Rocketeer is next up, but its 5 charge damage is very expensive in the 6th slot. Finally, Sacrificial Pact needs a demon to even be playable in the first place. Warlocks are rare in the arena, so it's extremely unlikely you'll get to cast it on the opponent's card, which means you'll probably gib a minion you own, spending 2 cards to gain 5 HP. Utter garbage in the arena, and Constructed right now. Void Caller is a bit expensive for its stats, but at least there's upside if you can plop a demon from your hand down when it dies. I used to be a fan of Dancing Swords, but that dream has died a bit since the death rattle is too painful. It sometimes draws removal spells from the opponent, but it's a 4 HP minion, and it's too easy to clear for many classes, giving them a card for the kill, which is never pleasant. Dread Corsair has Taunt, but don't be fooled, it's not worth the 4 mana for the stats. We have no weapons, so it will never be discounted. Pitlord comes with a hefty price, but if you can stick it turn 4, it can make it up to you and then some with its crazy 11 stats. Its only dangers are Fireball and hard removal, but otherwise against other minions it should be at least a 2-for-1. Echoing Ooze is good if you have the buffs, but Warlocks have very few useful buffs for the Ooze to duplicate. It will almost always be 2 1/2s, good stats but poor allocation. Bane of Doom is expensive removal that can sometimes land big with a Dread Infernal or other top-end demon, but many times won't give you anything thrilling. Not consistent enough or enough damage for 5 mana to risk a flop like Voidwalker or Blood Imp. Not the greatest trio, but we go with the Gadgetzan Auctioneer, who has the best upside out of these. He fails the vanilla test at 5 mana for a 4/4, but if I can land it with a few spells, it could provide some value. Welling's Soul would be up next. Since I'm not too thrilled with the battle cry, it presents less upside and more downside than the Gadgetzan, and neither has fantastic stats for their cost, so I'm going with one who can do more. Mana Wraith has weak stats, and its battle cry goes against everything that makes Warlock strong, pumping out a lot of bodies on the board. It will likely hurt us much more than it would help us. Harvest Golem is a very strong value card due to how difficult it is to remove efficiently. It has a solid chance at 2-for-1ing early 3/2 drops as well, and is one of the best 3 drops we can get. Leper Gnome is a fast start aggressive card that Warlocks tend to like, but the 1 HP scares me off here. Priestess of Elun's battlecry is probably best for Warlock over any other hero since life tap can bring you down more than you might be comfortable with, but it's still a pretty bad card in general and pales in comparison to our friendly neighborhood Golem. Zombie Chow is exactly what I want to see, a solid 1 mana cost minion to kick off the board control. As I mentioned in my other videos, I think Death Rattle is somewhat meaningless here. If you play Zombie Chow on turn 1 and trade it into the enemy's 2-drop, you've won a tempo battle, and the Death Rattle did nothing. Even in the late game, I'm not too upset about giving the enemy 5 HP if it means I can maintain board control. The times I don't like it are when I'm in a bad position and need to close the game out by scrapping together a handful of damage, but I still think it's a top tier 1-drop. Mortal Coil is also handy, but it's more of an assistant and utility card to finish something else off. Grimscale Oracle is very bad with its poor stats and its double-edged ability. We don't know how many Murlocs we might get in the draft, and it's not worth the gamble for such a mediocre return. Hopefully no one picked anything but Soulfire. Why is Soulfire so good? Firstly, the 4 damage is flexible and can be used as minion removal or closing face damage. Secondly, it's free! Well, technically it's not free. You still do have to discard a card in your hand, but you can choose what you want to play first before casting it if you want to increase the chances of it discarding a dead weight card. Or if you have nothing in your hand, then it truly is free since you can't discard a card you don't have. Card advantage means less for a Warlock than it does for any other class because of their hero ability, which is so easy to refill your hand up with. This combination makes Soulfire one of, if not the, best cards the Warlock has. I'll glaze over the other two. Poor stats for their cost, the taunt from Grunt won't make up for its 2/2 body. Back-to-back Soulfires, this makes my comments on this pick very redundant. All I'll say is Mortal Coil is so much better than the Boar. Would you rather deal 1 damage from the Boar that's blocked by taunts? Or would you instead prefer 1 damage to any minion that gives you a chance to draw a card? The only thing Boar has going for it is it could be buffed and can attack the face, but 9 times out of 10 you'll be happier with Coil in the arena. Cobra is the clear pick here since it will almost always go 1-for-1 with a card trade, sometimes netting even more value if it lives the first time. When I have the board in the late game, Cobra can be great insurance to prevent the enemy from dropping one huge beefcake on board, or they'll have to spend removal on the Cobra, which could otherwise have been used to clear a valuable target. Nerubian Egg might catch some by surprise. It's so good in Warlock Constructed, and again you'd be right, but in Constructed you can rely on a bunch of activators in your deck to make use of the egg. So far we're a third of the way through the deck, and our only options are a Lucky Master Swordsmith proc, or Soulfiring our own egg, which is a terrible idea. It's too risky, we might have the egg sit dormant all game and be a wasted slot. Alarmobot is already terrible, but when we're trying to get a fast curve, nothing would make me sadder than it bringing out a 1 or 2 mana minion for my hand. Go to the gym, Alarmobot! This one was an interesting pick, but I ultimately went with Molten Giant. Molten Giant is the best in the Warlock deck because you can control your HP somewhat with life tap, and in most games you'll be cutting it into your life a bit, so it's often playable. Pitlord is great as discussed earlier, but we already have one, and I'm not thrilled with the idea of eating 10 face damage between the two of them. Captain is just a plucky 3/3 for 3 that doesn't do anything spectacular. That alone isn't necessarily a bad thing, but plopping down a cheap 8/8 is far more appealing to me. Tiger is a 5/5 for 5 that chooses its targets and can't be removed by Flamestrike. A very good setup card that gives you a chance to make an efficient trade, and can help turn a losing game around if you have a good follow-up. Blood Imp used to be good when it was a 1/1 and it gave all your side 1 HP right away, but sadly its current form is often pretty useless. Corruption is straight up bad. You spend a card to remove something, but the opponent can choose to do whatever they want with that card that you cast Corruption on their turn. Since you know and they know that it's doomed, they'll probably run into one of your minions, and voila, you've just 2-for-1'd yourself in card advantage. The only time it can find value is if you have no minions on the board for them to run the card into, but if it's their turn and you have no minions on the board, you've probably already lost the game. I already have a Pit Lord, but that doesn't scare me off from the wonderful Flame Imp. A 3-2 on turn 1 is very nice to establish the board in the early game, and self-damage just got a whole lot more appealing with a Molten Giant in my deck. Geomancer's spell power has some use with the 2 Soul Fires, but it's generally still a subpar 2-drop. Stoneskin Gargoyle has a stat problem. It might sometimes survive an attack from a 3-2, but that's about all it does, and there aren't any buffs in Warlock that it could benefit from. There are very few times I would ever envision grabbing a Gargoyle. Defender of Argus is a priority pick since my deck is going to be board control oriented, and I hope to have enough early drops that at least something will survive by turn 4. Its stats are poor by themselves, but if you can buff 2 minions with the buff, he's comparable to Yeti in terms of stats, plus provides taunt. Yes, in some ways he falls into the trap of being too reliant on outside circumstances, but placing minions on our board is bread and butter, so it's not too far of a reach. Mind Control Tech is a premium 3-drop, but its battlecry shouldn't be too effective for me in most games since I plan on keeping the board relatively clear. Yes, there are times when you can turn a game around with the card stealing their best minion, but statistically speaking it should whiff far more than it hits. Wailing Soul has the same issues from before and me not wanting to silence my stuff, and it's simply outclassed by the quality of the other 2 cards in this set. Mortal Coil is good enough to beat these scrubs. It's flexible and can replace itself if you kill something with it, which you should pretty much always do. Narrowbar's stats are bad but passable on a 2-drop, but the real issue here is its ability hurts a lot of the cards I have already drafted, and like the Mana Wraith from earlier, I'm concerned it's going to bog my hand down. Elven Archer has nice utility, but Mortal Coil is better because it can be replacing a card, while Elven Archer just farts around as a measly 1-1 after the battlecry is used. Oh man, double Molten in the house. The hand-locked dream of 2 8/8s for 0 mana has been born. I talked about Molten and Bane of Doom already, and I'll add that Doomsayer has a powerful ability, but utilizing it effectively happens much more in Constructed. In the arena, it's much more likely to trade 1-for-1 with another early game minion, or just absorb 7 damage that would otherwise have been directed at your face. Not really a contender here. No pain, no gain. With 2 Molten Giants, I'm fine taking another Flame Imp, especially compared to these 2 clowns. I talked about Sacrificial Pact being bad already, but Magma Rager is also pretty awful. Mages eat Ragers for breakfast, and mages are abundant in the arena. Spending 3 mana on a card that the mage can remove with their hero ability is awful. Silverhand Knight is a solid 5-drop that represents 12 stat points. True, it's susceptible to Flame Strike, but both minions have more than 1 HP, so they can't simply be hero powered away. Hellfire is a strong board clear, but it works both ways, and I think it's more likely I'll have the board than my opponent. Silvermoon Guardian isn't bad, but it's too expensive for its abilities. Scarlet Crusader is almost identical, with 1 less mana, so there's no need to shell out the extra mana for this big brother. Flesh-Eating Ghoul isn't great, but the hope is I'll have the board most of the time and it can sometimes be played on the turn where trades happen, therefore becoming a 4-3 out of the gate. Voidwalker is a 1-drop, but it has bad stats. It's only good against 2-1s and 1-1s, and most good players don't run too many of those in the arena. Both are better than the Thrallmar Farseer though. Its built-in Wind Fury can be strong in the right deck, but Warlock has no buffs and is therefore not in the right deck. Siphon Soul is expensive removal, but it's hard removal and we're happy grabbing 1 for our deck. The hope is we'll have the board or be in a close battle and clearing a big minion can be huge in turning the tide. Ravenhold Assassin is a whopping 7 attack creature in stealth, but it takes a turn to be able to utilize the 7 damage and its 5 HP body usually means it won't survive too long. Felguard is a lot of stats and taunt for 3 mana, but the drawback is too painful for us to bear. Setting us back in tempo like that is usually a short-term game but a long-term loss. I bet this pick will be contentious. I went with Mortal Coil here because I liked the appeal of a more early game, but Archmage as a 4/7 body with spell power upside isn't bad either. If this pick came up earlier in the draft, I probably would have taken the Archmage, but at this point I already have 2 Molten Giants, a Pit Lord, a Frost Elemental, and a Tiger. I'm more concerned with getting the early game situation under control right now. As we mentioned before, Corruption is pretty smelly and is the worst of the 3 by a mile. This one was hard, and I really wanted the Zombie Chow, but the value in Spectral Knight cannot be denied. 4/6 that can't be hit by spells is huge, almost guaranteeing it's going to clear at least one enemy minion. I went away from Zombie Chow here because I think Spectral Knight is a top value minion, but it took me a long time to make the decision. Void Caller is fairly weak at 4 mana, and the Death Rattle might have some upside, but I only have a handful of demons in this deck, and I don't think it's worth taking the worst card of the 3 for the chance at minor synergy. Fairy Dragon is just what the doctor ordered, a trusty 3/2 for 2 that can't be attacked by spells. Farseer and Voidwalker already came up as options earlier, and we passed them for reasons discussed. Another 2-drop that we'll be quite happy taking. Its Enrage ability won't usually be useful, but there might be times I can get some good value out of it. Lord of the Arena is a pretty lackluster 6-drop with low HP, and Voodoo Doctor falls into the 1 HP trap that we want to avoid whenever possible. All ugly choices, but surprisingly I went with a Loon here. Now that we have 2 Flame Imps and Pit Lord, we're talking over 10 face damage in the deck, not counting life taps. A little bit of Burst Heal might now prove useful, and the alternative cards are quite underwhelming. As I mentioned before, I have a ton of Battlecry minions in the deck, so Nerubar Weblord might be unplayable for me, and Corruption is still as bad as it was when it last popped up. I went back to the trusty Tidehunter, since while its 1 HP is mage fodder, it at least can't all be killed on the same turn by a mage. Still, this was pretty weak, and I see merit for Wolf Rider as well, which generally can be played as a 3 damage removal spell, since it's unlikely it will survive whatever it attacks. Succubus is worst here because it only has 3 HP, so it dies just as easily as anything else to most 2 and 3 drops. For the sake of comparison, Soulfire discards a card like Succubus, but Succubus isn't an immediate effect, so it's much less worthy of a card discard. Earthen Ring swooped in at the right time, a solid 3/3 for 3 with a battle cry that will often be relevant for my masochistic deck. Void Caller has the same problems as it did before, as does Dragonhawk. I don't need to say much more. Another 2 that might be able to help some of my other drops trade up is perfectly acceptable here. We already have enough beef for the Warlock deck, and I didn't think my War Golem was worth reaching for. Mogushan Warden has very poor stat allocation, and will rarely kill anything as its 1 damage will often be split among 2 or 3 targets. Scarlet Crusader has a very good chance to trade 2 for 1 in the early game, or at least it might eat up 2 mana from the enemy's hero ability in addition to making an even trade on the board. The 1 HP is usually irrelevant since the Divine Shield already makes it sticky. Hellfire is good but may hurt me more than the opponent, and Ironfur Grizzly isn't a bad 3 but gets outclassed by Scarlet Crusader in terms of value. Another Defender of Argus, and this curve shapes up quite nicely. Felguard's steep downside has already been discussed, and Demolisher sometimes can provide value if it can be protected, but as a standalone minion it usually doesn't live long enough to get many shots off, and their randomness of it all doesn't always translate into free card kills. Defender of Argus should help make earlier drops stronger, while Demolisher asks you to protect it if you want it to be useful. The draft has been completed. Let's take a minute to digest what we have and comment on it. First off, I really like the curve of this deck. I should usually have a smooth curve from 1 through 4, and have some minions at the top end that can help with tempo, such as Frost Elemental and the Molten Giants. I also have the ability to hurt and heal myself with various cards, so that can help me plan out the best times to unleash Molten Giants on my unsuspecting prey. Weaknesses of the deck might be that the late game is somewhat lacking, but that was partially by design since Warlocks play best when they move quickly and put on a lot of threats. With first impressions out of the way and the draft completed, let's look at how you did on the quiz. Remember, you should have started with 100 points and subtracted every time you picked something I thought was suboptimal. Behold! As usual, there were a few preference picks in this draft, so just because you might not have gotten a perfect score doesn't mean your deck was vastly inferior to mine. I will say though that there were a lot of straightforward picks in this draft, so being too different from mine probably meant your deck turned out a little weaker than it could have been. But this is only guesswork. Now all that's left is to give the deck a whirl and see how it plays out. What do you guys think this deck will end up going? Can I get 7 wins for at least 150 gold back? Will my deck's natural curve allow me to win some games outright? Will I get some decent Molten Giant value in this deck, or will they sit around in my hand? And how about all that self-damage? Will I be able to dance with death, or will I end up suiciding myself before I can pull off some sick combos? Be sure to tune in next Wednesday at HearthstonePlayers.com to see how this run ended up doing. If you enjoyed this video and want to see more, be sure to subscribe to the Hearthstone Players YouTube channel for new Hearthstone content every week, or check out my personal YouTube channel if you want to see some other games I've been fiddling around with. As always, I've been MrShine, and I'll see you next time!
Narcisetto ad d'amor